Farmhouse smelled like cedar and old rain the first night I slept there alone. I sat on the edge of a bare mattress my husband had left, listening to the wind push against the windows, and I thought, he knew. He always knew. Let me back up. My name is Ruth, and I'm 64 years old. I taught second grade for 31 years at Millbrook Elementary in upstate Vermont. And for 38 of those years, I was married to a quiet, careful man named Gordon who fixed things with his hands and said exactly what he meant and never once raised his voice at me. When he died of a stroke 18 months ago, I thought the worst thing that could happen to me had already happened. I was wrong. Gordon and I had one son, Elliot. He was 41 when his father passed, and he lived in Atlanta with his wife, a woman named Serena who had worked in commercial real estate and had very specific opinions about everything. The right neighborhoods, the right schools, the right kind of people to know. She was beautiful in that deliberate way, always put together, always watching the room while she smiled at you. I had tried, genuinely tried, for 8 years to love her. Some days I got close. When Gordon passed, his estate went through probate like any other. He had a will. He had always been meticulous about things like that. Insurance policies filed in labeled folders, the deed to the house in a fireproof box under the bed, a handwritten list of account numbers taped to the inside of his sock drawer. I knew about most of it. But there were two properties. Our family home in Millbrook, the white colonial with the wide porch where Elliot had grown up, and a piece of land Gordon had inherited from his own father, 42 acres in rural western Vermont, out past Rutland, with a farmhouse on it that nobody had lived in seriously since the 1990s. The attorney read the will at his office on a gray Tuesday in November. Elliot sat across from me in a charcoal blazer. Serena had not come, which I noticed. The Millbrook house went to Elliot. The farmland went to me. Elliot said nothing at first. He nodded slowly, the way he did when he was calculating something. On the drive back, he was quiet, and when he dropped me at the house, he said, "We'll figure out the details." And I didn't ask what he meant by that. I found out 6 weeks later. I had been staying at the Millbrook house, in my own bedroom in my own home of 22 years, while Elliot and Serena stayed in Atlanta and discussed what to do with the property. That's how it was framed to me. What to do with the property? As though I were a piece of furniture, they were deciding whether to reupholster or donate. Elliot called me on a Sunday evening in January. He said he and Serena had been talking. He said the Millbrook market was strong right now. He said the house would list well in spring. He said maybe this was a good time for me to think about my next chapter. I asked him what he meant. He said, "Mom, you're 63. You're alone in a 5-bedroom house. It's a lot of maintenance." I said, "I've maintained it for 22 years. He said, "I know, but things are different now." I asked him where he thought I should go. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "There's the farm property. It's yours. You could spend some time there. Fix it up if you wanted. It might be good for you. A project." I sat with the phone pressed to my ear and looked around the kitchen, at the yellow curtains I'd made myself, at the hook by the door where Gordon's keys still hung, and I said, "I'll think about it." 3 weeks later, Serena called. Not Elliot. Serena. She was efficient about it. She said they had spoken to a realtor. She said the listing would go live in April. She said she wanted to give me plenty of time to make arrangements. She used the word arrangements 4 times in a 10-minute phone call. At the end, she said, "The farmhouse in Rutland is yours, Ruth. It's not nothing. It's actually a really good opportunity if you look at it the right way." I said, "Is that how you look at it?" She said, "Honestly, yes. Gordon left you something you can make your own. Elliot got the house, but you got the land. Land last." And then she said, "And I've replayed this moment more times than I can count." She said, "Besides, it probably suits you better anyway. Something simpler, something quieter. I always thought you were more of a farmhouse person than a colonial person." I didn't say anything. She said, "I mean that as a compliment." She did not mean it as a compliment. I packed my own boxes. Elliot offered to hire movers, which I accepted because I was 63 years old and I wasn't going to be foolish about pride. I took the yellow curtains. I took Gordon's keys. I took every photograph off every wall and I wrapped them in the dish towels from the kitchen drawer and I put them in the back of my Subaru myself. The day I left, Serena was there. She had flown up to oversee the transition, which meant she walked through the rooms making notes on her phone while I carried the last of my bags out. When I passed her in the hallway, she smiled at me and said, "I really think this is going to be good for you, Ruth. Fresh start." I nodded. She said, "The farmhouse will have character, older homes always do." I said, "Yes." She said, "I saw photos. It's rustic. Very you." And I put my hand on the doorframe of the house I had lived in for 22 years, and I looked at her and I said, "Take care of it." And I said, "Take care of it." And I said, the drive to Rutland took 2.5 hours. It was March, still cold. The fields on either side of Route 4 still half frozen and brown. I had the address Gordon had written on an index card in his handwriting, which I kept on the passenger seat and looked at more than I needed to because I just wanted to see something he had touched. The farmhouse was at the end of a gravel drive flanked by old maples. It was white once, or had been. The paint had weathered to a pale gray in places. The porch roof sagged slightly on the left side. The front door was red, which surprised me, and still bright, which surprised me more. I sat in the car for a long time. I had a key. Gordon's attorney had handed me in an envelope. I had a sleeping bag because I didn't know what condition the bedding would be in. I had a box of groceries and a thermos of coffee and approximately no idea what I was doing. I went inside. The house was cold but dry. Someone had maintained it. The pipes hadn't burst. The floors were solid underfoot. There was a working wood stove in the main room with a small stack of birch logs beside it. On the kitchen counter there was an envelope with my name on it. Ruth, in Gordon's handwriting. I stood in the middle of that cold kitchen and I couldn't open it. Not yet. I sat down on the floor with my back against the cabinets and I cried for a while, which I hadn't let myself do very much since the funeral, because there always seemed to be something practical that needed doing. Then I got up, built a fire in the wood stove, and made coffee. Then I opened the letter. Gordon had written it 2 years before he died. He had known, in the way that quiet, careful people sometimes know things, that his heart wasn't as reliable as it used to be. He hadn't told me the extent of it because he said in the letter that he didn't want me to spend the years we had left watching him instead of living. He wrote that the farmland had been appraised, but that the appraisal didn't capture everything. He wrote that a geology survey done by his father in the 1970s had found indicators of something. He used the phrase mineral potential, and that he had never pursued it because it wasn't the right time, but that he had paid out of his own savings to have a more recent study done 2 years ago. He wrote that the results were interesting and that I should contact a man named Howard Briggs at a land management office in Burlington if I ever wanted to know more. He wrote, "I didn't give you the colonial because I knew they'd find a way to take it. I gave you this because it's yours in a way they can't touch." I read that sentence 4 times. Then I called Howard Briggs. It took 3 weeks to get an appointment and another 6 weeks after that to get the full report. What it said, in language that took me 2 readings and 1 phone call to a retired engineer friend to understand, was that the eastern portion of the property showed significant deposits of talc, industrial-grade talc, the kind used in ceramics manufacturing, paper production, cosmetics. Vermont had historically been one of the largest talc-producing regions in the country. Most of those operations had closed decades ago, but demand had shifted, and several manufacturing companies had in the past 18 months been quietly approaching private landowners in the region about mineral rights agreements. Howard Briggs put me in contact with a land attorney in Montpelier. The land attorney put me in contact with 2 companies who had already inquired about properties in my county. By June, I had received 2 formal written offers for a mineral rights lease, not a sale, a lease, which the attorney explained was better for me in the long run because I would retain ownership of the land. The first offer was for $420,000 up front, plus royalties. The second was for $610,000 with a different royalty structure. I sat at the kitchen table in the farmhouse, which I had by then painted and recurtained and furnished slowly with things I liked. And I looked at those two numbers, and I thought about Serena saying, "Very you," in that particular tone of voice. I thought about that a lot, actually. While I was patching the porch roof with a neighbor named Walt, who was 71 and had been fixing things on this road since before I was born. While I was learning how to start the old John Deere tractor that had been sitting in the barn and discovering it still ran, while I was planting tomatoes along the south fence line because the soil was extraordinary, deep and dark and almost unbelievably good, while I was slowly and then all at once falling in love with 42 acres of land that had been waiting for me, Elliot called in May. He called to check in, he said, to see how things were going. I told him things were fine. I asked about his work. I asked about the house. He said the Millbrook house had sold quickly, over asking. He said they were happy with how it had gone. I said, good. He asked a little carefully, have you looked into the farm property at all? The land? I said, some. He said, I've been wondering if it might be worth having it appraised, if you ever wanted to sell it. Or if there was development potential, you could. I said, I'm not interested in selling. He was quiet for a moment. I said, I like it here, Elliot. He said, really? It wasn't a question exactly. It was the tone of someone recalculating. In September, I signed the lease with the second company. My land attorney was thorough and patient and charged me a fair rate. The agreement covered the eastern 40% of the property, the talc deposits, while leaving the rest of the land, including the farmhouse and the fields I had planted, completely untouched. The royalty payments would begin the following year once extraction operations started, and they would continue for the life of the deposit. The upfront payment cleared my account in October. I paid off the equity line Gordon and I had taken out years ago for Elliot's graduate school tuition, which had always bothered me quietly. I set aside money for property taxes and maintenance. I had my furnace replaced and the porch fully rebuilt. I wrote a check to the local land conservation trust for an amount that made me feel for the first time in a long time like myself. Elliot found out in November. I hadn't hidden it exactly, but I hadn't announced it either. His cousin mentioned it at Thanksgiving, my late husband's niece, who lived in Burlington and had heard about the lease from someone at a regional business association meeting, because these things move through small communities. Elliot called me that same evening. He said, why didn't you tell me? I said, I handled it. He said, Mom, that's a significant financial transaction. You should have had someone help you with that. I said, I had a land attorney. He said, I mean family. I held the phone and looked out the kitchen window at the dark field and the tree line and the sky full of stars that you could actually see from here, unlike anywhere I'd lived before. I said, you had the house, Elliot. Your father made sure you had the house. He was quiet. I said, he made sure I had this. I heard him exhale. Then he said, I didn't know about the minerals. I said, neither did I, not until I read his letter. Another silence. He said quietly, he wrote you a letter? I said yes. He said, what did it say? And I thought about everything I could tell him. About the survey, about the lease, about Howard Briggs and the land attorney and the two offers, about the tomatoes I'd grown and the tractor I'd learned to start and the way Walt had laughed the first time I'd managed it without help, about the yellow curtains in the kitchen window, about waking up at 6 a.m. to real quiet, the kind that has texture to it, the kind I didn't know I'd been missing. About the sentence, I gave you this because it's yours in a way they can't touch. I said, he said he loved me and that he knew what he was doing. Elliot didn't say anything for a moment. And then he said, in a voice that sounded a little bit like the boy I had raised, I'm sorry, Mom. About the house, about how it happened. I said, I know. He said, Serena thought, we thought. I said, I know what you thought. He said, are you okay? Are you actually okay out there? I looked around my kitchen. the fire going in the wood stove, Gordon's keys hanging on the hook by the back door, the hook I'd put there myself because I needed to see them somewhere, the curtains I'd made from yellow cotton I'd found at a fabric store in Rutland on a Saturday afternoon when I had nowhere to be and the whole day in front of me. I said, I'm better than okay. I meant it. I still mean it. It is February now, and there is 2 feet of snow on the ground, and Walt came by yesterday with his plow and cleared my drive without being asked, because that is what people do out here. The extraction work on the eastern acreage doesn't disturb the farmhouse at all. I can't see it from my windows, can't hear it unless the wind is blowing in a particular direction, and the company's site manager stops by once a month to give me an update and always accepts a cup of coffee. The royalty payments started in January. They are, to use Gordon's word, interesting. Serena sent me a text message in December. It said she hoped I was enjoying the farmhouse and that she had always believed in the property's potential. I read it twice, and then I put my phone in my pocket and went out to check on the bird feeders I'd installed along the south fence. I don't think about Serena very much anymore. I think about Gordon. I think about the way he must have sat with this, with the survey results and the attorney consultations and the letter he wrote me, and just waited, knowing that whenever the time came, I would be all right. That man spent his whole life making sure I would be all right. I think I always knew the kind of man he was. But understanding it now, from here, standing on this land he left me with the snow on the fields and the maples along the drive and 42 acres of Vermont that are mine in a way nothing can touch, I think I understand it more completely than I ever have before. He gave me exactly what I needed. He just knew I'd have to find that out for myself. I keep coming back to something Gordon wrote near the end of that letter. Not the part about the minerals, not the instructions about Howard Briggs. Just that one sentence, I gave you this because it's yours, in a way they can't touch. He didn't write that out of bitterness. I know him well enough to know that. He wrote it because he understood something I had to learn the hard way, that the things we build quietly, over decades, with steadiness and without announcement, are the things that actually hold. The Colonial on Millbrook Road was beautiful. I loved it. But it was also visible, appraised, argued over in a probate attorney's office on a gray Tuesday in November. The farm was different. The farm required someone willing to sit on a cold kitchen floor and cry first, and then get up and build a fire. I think about Serena sometimes, not with anger anymore, mostly with a kind of clarity. She looked at me and saw someone who had already peaked. A woman in her 60s, widowed, retired, no further upside. She made a calculation, the way people do when they believe that worth is something you can read off a person's surface. And she was wrong. But I don't think the lesson is about her. The lesson is about what happens when you do the right thing for long enough, when you are honest enough and careful enough and stubborn enough to keep going even when the going feels like driving 2.5 hours on a frozen March highway toward a property you've never slept in. There's a kind of intelligence that doesn't show up on any appraisal. Gordon had it. It was the intelligence of paying attention to the land, to people, to the long arc of things rather than the immediate return. He didn't pursue the mineral survey in a hurry. He waited until he understood what he was looking at. He consulted the right people. He documented everything, and then he put it in a letter and trusted me to find it when I was ready. That kind of thinking, patient, informed, rooted in something deeper than short-term gain, is what I try to practice now every day. When I'm talking to the site manager over coffee or working through the royalty statements with my accountant or deciding which fields to keep fallow for another season, and then there is the matter of just not quitting. I want to be honest about that part because I think it gets left out of stories like this one. There were weeks last spring when the farmhouse felt too quiet and too cold, and I wondered what on earth I was doing out here at 63, with a wood stove I'd learned to operate from a YouTube video and a tractor that had needed 3 attempts to start. I missed my kitchen in Millbrook. I missed the sound of the neighborhood. I missed Gordon in a way that is hard to describe. Not as an absence, but as a presence. I kept reaching for and finding just slightly out of range. I stayed anyway. I planted the tomatoes anyway. I called Howard Briggs anyway. That stubbornness, I won't dress it up as anything more elegant than what it was, turned out to be the thing that mattered most. Not the minerals, not the attorney, not the lease. The decision, made quietly and without applause, to stay and find out what the land was worth before I let anyone tell me. Walt came by this morning to check the fence line along the north field. He's 71 and he's been on this road his whole life and he doesn't say much, but when he left, he looked back at the farmhouse and said, "Place suits you." I think Gordon would have agreed.